Next, I'd like to introduce to you two fantastic speakers and practitioners in their fields. Dr. Helen Szoke, who is the Chief Executive of Oxfam Australia. Her career accomplishments include Commissioner of the Victorian Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission and Race Discrimination Commissioner for the Australian Human Rights Commission. Additionally, Helen has held numerous honorary and governance roles with non-profit organisations and has received awards and recognition for her work over many years in human rights, governance, public policy and leadership. She's a strong advocate on issues of human rights, poverty, inequality and gender and race equity. Welcome, Helen. And I'd also like to introduce to you Dr. Cassandra Goldie. Cassandra is the CEO of the Australian Council of Social Service. Dr. Goldie has public policy expertise on economic and social issues, civil society, social justice and human rights. Her former roles include Director of Sex and Age Discrimination with the Australian Human Rights Commission, Director and Principal Solicitor with the Darwin Community Legal Service and Senior Executive with Legal Aid in Western Australia. In addition to being recognised in the Australian Financial Review's 100 Women of Influence, Dr. Goldie was selected as an AFR Boss True Leader and voted one of the Impact 25's most influential people in the social economy. Doesn't come much better than that. Furthermore, Cassandra was recognised by the AFR in 2015 on the annual Overt Power List.
I'm clearly doing something wrong.
So welcome to you both, and I think, Helen, you're going to kick us off.
That's lovely. And Cass and I have had this kind of parallel existence, but she's a Sydney girl, I'm the Melbourne girl. So it's fantastic that we have the opportunity to be on the same platform. So can I begin, first of all, by saying thank you very much for the invitation to talk today. And can I also begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and paying respects to elders past and present. And I really enjoyed that earlier session. But Jai, you remind us of the enormous job that we've got to do, particularly in relation to our First Nations people. And I was reminded of that this week with the 10th anniversary of the Northern Territory intervention and the fact that that's still in place. So I want to take a bit of a different tact perhaps to what we've been focusing on. And Oxfam obviously is an international aid organisation. So I want to share some of the stories that we deal with and then perhaps bring it back to the Australian context. So this is Rashida. She is a real person. She's a human being. She's 24. She's young. She lives in Chittagong in Bangladesh. And she is living in an area where Oxfam has worked for 45 years. So we have a long and deep relationship with many partners in Bangladesh. Bangladesh is an incredible country for those of you who've been there. At the time of the independence movement, there were about 60 million people. There's now 160 million people there. And you'll know that Bangladesh is a source of cheap labour. It has a growing middle class, like many Asian countries do. It offers huge potential for businesses looking to export and expand. And yet, despite economic growth in this country, almost 40 million people, so nearly double the population of Australia, are still living below the national poverty line, and more than 20 million people are living in extreme poverty. And we're talking about poverty which is quite unprecedented. So about a third of the people in Bangladesh don't have access to a decent toilet and all of the kind of consequences that brings. Now, Rashida's case is not unique. She's one of many families that live in really dire conditions. And I've been to Dakar and seen some of these conditions, and I can tell you that her circumstances are replicated many times over. So she shares 2 cramped rooms with her children, her husband and her mother-in-law. Usually these are tin-roofed and often galvanised iron-walled huts, which are squeezed in the cities in Bangladesh between factories and many other accommodation. Often up to 25 people from several families share a single toilet and a water tap, and often that water is cut off. So there's a channel of filthy, polluted water, including human waste, which actually runs through narrow yards where these people bathe, where children play, where they prepare their food. And in the rainy season, of course, that we're seeing at the moment in many parts of Asia, these areas just overflow. So Rashida has the experience of many mothers in countries like Bangladesh. She has Muhammad, who's 18 months old, and she also has a daughter. And often they're both ill with diarrhoea, which is to be expected when you're living in those conditions. And she has to decide whether to buy medicine or to buy food. And to cover medical expenses, often the family borrows money from neighbours and they get into debt. And then they begin the cycle of poverty that is so familiar that you would think that we would have sorted and learned how to break by now. So this is a story which is replicated many times across the world and in this country. Good health, a safe home, clean water, education, these are all basic human rights. And economic prosperity has helped bring millions of people out of dire poverty, but it's also left many people behind. And we've heard over and over again that inequality is widening, and it's hardly surprising. And as we've heard, I think, from the previous two presentations, it's easier to build wealth from a position of wealth. And I think Jai's position, you need equity before you can have equality, is a really wonderful way of capturing that sentiment. So some of these statistics I hope you're familiar with, because Oxfam's been doing a lot of work on the modelling of what's happening in relation to wealth across the world. So this year, our modelling told us that 8 men, and they are men, today own as much wealth as the poorest half of all humanity. So that's 8 people on one side of the scales and 3.6 billion people, 3.6 billion people on the other side of the scale. And the 8 men could fit into this golf buggy. I don't know if this is Donald Trump's golf course. Could be. He'd certainly have those golf buggies. And here in Australia, we're also seeing inequality rise, and Cass will talk more about this, but let me give you the high-level statistics. The richest 1% in Australia own more wealth than the bottom 70% of the population combined. And it just doesn't make economic or moral sense to have such a concentration of wealth. And the gap between the elite and the poor is a fundamental problem, because what we have with the concentration of wealth is, of course, the concentration of power. And then how do we actually get to a position where we change that? So it's interesting that globally this discussion about inequality has come to a consensus view that extreme inequality is actually bad for economic growth. But the problem is the elite can favour policies to suit themselves, and that they can exert much greater influence than those people who are actually struggling at the bottom of this incredible yawning inequality gap. So how many of us can lobby the government for a loan to build a railway line connecting our coal mine to a port? There's not many. How many of us can afford an army of tax accountants to reduce our tax bills to zero? We know that large multinationals are able to manipulate their corporate structures to avoid paying billions in tax in the countries where they operate, and this means that governments are actually missing out. There's a prior question, will governments actually invest in the necessary social protections that are needed across the world? But they're not even getting a chance to make those decisions because they're not getting the revenue that they should be getting. We heard just last week about the extent of such tax avoidance right here in Australia at the public hearing on corporate tax avoidance, and we saw Google and Facebook suddenly declared millions more in revenue in Australia as a result of the scrutiny that's put on them, and some are following suit. And we expect the ATO expects $7 billion in sales will now be booked and taxed in Australia as a result of the new anti-tax avoidance laws. But it's not just Australia that's missing out. In our economic modelling that we've done, we estimate that Australian-based multinational companies using tax havens cost developing countries around $2.8 billion a year. So these are just the Australian-based multinational companies in their tax avoidance tactics. And globally, the OECD estimates developing countries are losing between $100 to $240 billion a year every year in revenue. And this is money which potentially can go to hospitals, to roads, it can pay for doctors, it can pay for teachers. In fact, $214 billion covers the cost of providing hygienic toilets or sewerage treatment to every single person in Bangladesh and Pakistan 7 times over. It's a lot of money that could go a long way. So not everyone's getting a share of the growing pie, and if we see who's benefiting, then overwhelmingly we can see that the gap is widening. So over the past 25 years, the global top 1% has gained more income growth than the bottom 50% put together. I mean, these are staggering figures if you actually put individual people into the frame and think of the difference in how acute this is. In Africa, for example, decades of record GDP growth benefit a wealthy elite, but 50 million people on the African continent are still living in extreme poverty. And closer to home, we've seen Asia moving more to be middle class, middle economies. But in Indonesia, for example, we see that on the Gini coefficient ranking, it's increased from 0.3 in 2000 to 0.41 in 2013, even though its economy went through spectacular economic growth. So this gap is incredible in terms of widening. And we know, for example, that this gap is very acute in the context of Australia. So I'm a Melbourne girl. For 7 years, Melbourne was crowned the world's most livable city, and that paints a rosy picture of the second largest city, but its ranking misses, actually, for example, the number of people sleeping rough in Melbourne. And that's more than doubled over 7 years. And this photo is actually the tent city that was recently dismantled in Martin Place in Sydney, right at the base of the RBA. And this is a constant reminder, a graphic reminder of how the lives of people have been impacted as this inequality gap grows. So what we've seen is that trickle-down economics simply doesn't work. So the rising tide doesn't bring everyone as it rises. And Oxfam and other organisations like ACOS are in very good company, because the OECD and the IMF have also recently shown that wages have stalled in spite of people's hard work, and working people, and particularly women, sit at the bottom of big corporations that are keeping working conditions poor. One of the things that we're working on is actually the garment industry, because it is predominantly women. And we see that women are working in factories producing clothes for all sorts of brands that are very familiar to us, and both in Australia and the international global brands. We're focusing on labour rights with these women, and this is our naughty and nice list, which actually lists the garment manufacturers that either work in Australia, the retailers that work in Australia or sell in Australia, that are doing something to improve the conditions of garment workers. So labour rights are what are needed for many of these women who basically work to put the clothes on our back here in Australia. These are women who are working in countries like Myanmar, in Bangladesh and Vietnam. Often they work 6 days a week, sometimes 7. Sometimes they work up to 23 hours a day. They often earn less than $4 a day for their labour, and they struggle to make ends meet. Often they come in from regional areas, they move into the cities, they move into the sort of accommodation that I described that Radesh lives in, crammed into big cities like Dakar, with a view to actually sending money back to the region, but they don't even earn enough to have enough to send back to their families. They struggle to make ends meet, they frequently fall into debt, and if they get sick, they don't get paid. If they get pregnant, they lose their job. So the gender bias is not exclusive to developing countries. The gender gap in Australia is around 16%, but the gender gap in these countries is even greater. So inequality is a scourge that is really impacting on millions of people across the world. So growing inequality is not part of some natural phenomena that we have no control over. It's actually a product, and we heard this before from Jeff, that it's a product of political and economic choices, and the effect of it is that it's actually trapping people into poverty. We need the kind of economy with businesses that power opportunities, one that create decent jobs and decent pay, that restore the environment rather than just extract from it, and that treat women and girls equally. We need businesses that actually respect the land, that respect the cultural and sovereign aspects of land across the world, in this country and in many other countries. And we also need an economy in which governments defend and respect the voices of citizens and listen to ordinary people. Governments need to make the rules fair for all. Countries must collaborate to close corporate tax loopholes and make multinational corporations pay their fair share of tax. These are the kind of policies that we should be arguing for here. We've seen some little glimmers of light about when governments do take up this proactive action, that they actually can make a difference. But I think there's a lot more that needs to be done, and we need to be calling for a shift to a fairer system for all, and understand that that's going to be resisted by those who are benefiting from the great gap that exists at the moment in terms of inequality. But it's terrifically important that inequality is finally on the public agenda for the moment, although a disputed fact, but we need to optimise the opportunity to talk about it greatly. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thanks, Helen. Helen mentioned that we do tend to be ships in the night, and I must say it was also for me a fantastic chance to be spending and listening to some of the detail of the thinking and the great work that's being done at Oxfam. Look, I want to acknowledge traditional owners, pay my respects to elders past and present, and again, some fantastic presentations that during the time that I've been able to be here, to really thank the TJRyan Foundation for bringing us together, including Helen and myself, and to thank Michael for his warm invitation to come to Warm Brizzy. So lovely to be here. And look, I'm happy to get political because it is essentially political, this topic. It's been a very busy week for the Australian Council of Social Service. In fact, it's been a very busy years. We had a global financial crisis. And one of the stories that often gets told about Australia is that, look, we did pretty well, we weathered the storm, the ravages in other countries, but, we did well. And, of course, our, widely lauded finance ministers and treasurers love to go on the global stage and talk about that. Yes, indeed. And, of course, the government policies at the time were very, very important in providing that kind of economic stimulus. But the reality, of course, is that we are in a period of austerity. We have a determined effort by government to be austere. And in order to support that agenda of cutting government spending, it is being supported by political rhetoric. A number of the senior ministers of the current federal government are particularly active in fostering this rhetoric. The first rhetoric is that poverty isn't a problem. If we're talking about poverty, really we should be looking at the absolute poverty measure, a few dollars a day. And of course in Australia, if you are relying on social security, you're doing pretty well. And in fact, we could probably make some more savings there. So I've been in a couple of Senate committee hearings just this week where the government, despite its best efforts to rip a lot out of the social security system, which it wasn't able to do from that 2014 budget, it's having another go. So we've now got about $1.6 billion in cuts. This time what the government has done has sort of unbundled them into a whole lot of little cuts that add up to a lot of money. The base rate of the New Start allowance, if you're unemployed, if you're on the lowest fixed income in Australia, is $38 a day. And the other rhetoric, of course, is that if you're not doing well, it's your fault. It's an individual flaw. You're lazy. Because there is plenty of work out there. And so the government is right now trying to tighten the screws on the compliance system. So they're going to try and make $200 million in budget savings from cutting more people off from Social Security more often with harsher penalties because you're just not trying hard enough. We've got, the other idea, of course, is that you have a bad drug and alcohol problem. So we're going to drug test you. I had the honour to be listening to the best health experts in the country give their evidence to the Senate committee this week, where they reminded the committee that we have 200,000 people in drug and alcohol rehabilitation services at the moment. We have another 200,000 people who are ready and willing and wanting to deal with their addiction and cannot get into services because of a lack of money, and a significant number of those people have self-identified to Centrelink today. They are there already saying, I want help. Okay, but, that's the problem. What's the other problem? Oh, well, you're a liar and a cheat. So the current policy which fosters this idea, of course, we had the robo-debt. That was a significant effort to make a significant savings, clawing back over the last 6 years. But most recently, one of the policies, I just want to, for the single mothers and parents of Australia, I want to make sure you haven't missed this one. What we've got is a government proposal that if into the future, if you're a single parent wanting to rely on we're needing to rely on Social Security in the future, you will have to get a third party to go on statutory declaration to say that you are single. Yep. You're not sleeping with somebody, you're not living with them, you need to get a third party statutory declaration. So what we're suggesting there is, look, we think a lot of people provide information to both the tax office and Centrelink about their set of circumstances. Yes, I use this car for business purposes. Yes, I use my home for 40% of my time to run my business, etc. We're going to believe absolutely everybody except the single parents of Australia who have to get a statutory declaration to say I'm not lying. So these are the kinds of cultural contexts of the debate that the current federal government is pursuing through a policy environment. But I think in our view, and I'm very pleased to see the level of interest in the room this afternoon, Friday afternoon, on the issue of poverty and inequality, is that it is a problem. And we think that one of the reasons that while certain parts of the media and some people in the community, because of pre-held conceptions, think that all these policies might be worth a go, the overwhelming sentiment in the community is that things aren't good. That poverty and inequality is a problem in Australia, and I possibly will rattle off the slides. I'll get to that. But fairly recently, I did happen to go to one of those AFR events. I was there, yes, and I was on a panel with a number of people, including Brian Loughnane, who is the former president of the Australian Liberal Party. And it was a topic about populism, the sort of what had happened with Brexit, what happened with Trump, and what are we dealing with in Australia. And we have mostly been talking about economic inequality, I think, but of course we do have deep issues of racism, discrimination, and cultural and social inequality, and a very unfortunately right now a very nasty debate which is being generated associated with gay, lesbian, queer, trans and intersex people. And I am a queer person and I'm not very happy about that. But Brian Loughnane, coming back to him, he said on that panel, the major parties have to deal with poverty and inequality in Australia. Now, we will have a lot of debates about the best way to do that, but of course the most important starting point is for us to get to a point where the government of the day has a policy agenda which is about addressing it. And so that is absolutely up to all of us. So we have to, I think, both continue to share the knowledge about the reality in Australia and the globe, and to then be gathered in places such as this where we grapple with the really smart policy solutions and build the consensus on that. So I don't know, maybe I'm not where I'm meant to be on that. Did I lose it? Did I lose it? Just bring it back for just a moment. That's all right. Peter Saunders was here this morning, and unfortunately I wasn't here this morning, but we have collaborated with the University of New South Wales over doing trend analysis on poverty and inequality in Australia since 2012. Can I just get a sense of the nod in the room for people who were there this morning about whether Peter covered that really, really well? Well, sorry, I'm sure he did. He's an excellent colleague, but he gave you the facts and stats. Okay, all right. Well, look, it doesn't really matter. I just wanted to have a backup that we do know that it is a credible measure that we are using about the poverty trend in Australia, the 50% OECD measure. The budget standards work. Did Peter talk about that? Ah, okay, all right. Well, he should have, because he's led the work with us, and it's a very important piece of research, which I'll touch on just briefly now. So, yes, we have been doing the analysis about poverty trends. It's almost 3 million people, including 730,000 children, and importantly, 40% of children are in single-parent families. All right. And when it comes to inequality, yes, it is absolutely right, of course, that Australia does not have the extremes of inequality that we are seeing in other countries, and there are some very important institutional arrangements that have been in place in Australia to protect us from the worst of that, including our industrial relations system, including our social protection system, which have enabled us to mediate the power imbalances in society that Helen so beautifully highlighted is actually the guts of how we build the kind of society that we want. But we're definitely trending in the wrong direction. And when we did the work to look at the inequality trend in Australia, particularly the trend is associated with the trajectory of investment income. And of course, on the flip side of it, the lowering wages picture. So, hello. But I think just on the budget standards work, in this debate about, on the one hand, how much income you have, but then on the flip side, well, how much do you need? We do need to be able to persistently test the reality of the economic circumstances around the country and the kind of the budget that an individual or family needs in order that all my emails coming up there. It might be interesting. In order to meet your essentials. So I do. For those of you who are interested in the research, I will provide you with the analysis on the budget standards. What it's done is it has looked at a particular sort of set of profile of families and looked at the costs associated with essentials, housing, utilities, food. And what it's shown is that, for example, for an individual at the moment, if you are fully reliant on fixed incomes through the social security system, you are unable to cover the essentials by, on average, $96 per week. $96 a week. Now, in the jargon, that confirms what we know from other sources of research, which is that you are dis-saving. You do not have enough. And, of course, that's the most acute picture. But then when you come to the minimum wage, I think we're talking about maybe $45 you've got in terms of what Jeff was referring to as a discretionary income, to be able to spend at your discretion beyond meeting your essentials. So it is extremely, extremely tight. But of course, what probably most of us in this room is that we know we've got a problem. We know the basic protections are not where they should be. And the question for us is how we continue to lift up our voice and our efforts to drive the kinds of reforms that we need. And so I just want to take you through what ACOS sees as not everything, but certainly some of the big structural reforms that we believe are absolutely essential. Our starting point is, as Helen said, I won't necessarily say it's unique, but I think it is significant that we have an emerging, from the considered informed, determined sort of experts, an understanding about how critical it is to economic outcomes that we are focused on lifting up the living standards of the bottom 40% in any population. That is our core agenda. So there is a reason that we should be focusing on the bottom 40% of the community, because, of course, it is socially the right thing to do, but also it is economically the best, most sound policy associated with a flourishing economy. So there seems to be this consensus that we are, and it's hard work, but we're no longer amongst ourselves saying we've got social policy over here and economic policy over here. They are absolutely one and the same. So I think that for us, the core agenda on the income front is absolutely about fixing the adequacy of the social protection, the social security system, and getting the adequacy set for people who are currently not able to independently secure income through various forms of paid activity. The level of the social security system I've already mentioned, but the other part of it, which again, if you're not really in the detail of social security life, may shock you, is this thing called the liquid assets test. So what's that? That's about how much money if you lose your job, how much of your own resources you have to spend down on before you can access social protection support. Now, the rate of that is $5,000 for an individual. That was actually set in 1994 and hasn't been increased in dollar terms to 2017. So what we're doing is requiring people to be impoverished to draw down even on the base, the sort of few resources that you've built up before you can even get income support. So they're the two major things on that front. And then, of course, there's been a fair bit of discussion about what we need to be doing to fix the industrial relations system associated with security around paid employment, and also the extent to which you can participate in the kind of 1-2 job kind of environments in a way without needing to immediately go in and out of social security, because in that part of the population, the sort of 20-30% income bracket. That is the lived experience on a weekly, monthly basis. And so you have no sense of security about your flow of income because you are in this kind of environment of needing to predict your income in order to set your social security entitlement. Then you get some work and then you're trying to work out how much you'll have the next, so you have no sense of the stability in your income, and therefore it is restricting your confidence being able to know what you're likely to have over that next period of time. And it's deeply affecting people's behaviour as well as their economic security. That sense of confidence and certainty about what you can do, your mobility, your social decisions. The second thing is housing affordability. I don't know whether that's been touched on much in this session, but it is absolutely not enough what the federal government did. And in fact, when you put the scrutiny on that set of packages from the federal government, it did nothing for low-income households. All the financial investors, the private investors have said, yep, we kind of like what you've done. We reckon we might be able to get involved in some investing on what's called affordable housing, but none of it will actually stimulate any increased supply of social housing for people who are on lower incomes in Australia. And we think there is a huge agenda for us, which is quite an exciting one, for us to influence a potential future government who is more open to looking at social housing to really get that policy right. The universal services agenda. I think what's quite exciting is both in the community and also amongst many experts. We have had many years of experimentation around privatisation and competition policy in the delivery of human services, right? Healthcare, get rid of the private health insurance rebate. The public see it. The public see it. They're dropping out of private health insurance because it's going up at 6% per year. They can't tell what kind of cover they're going to get because it's already so complex, and there's a lot of exclusions in it. And, in fact, your out-of-pocket expenses are more than you've ever had to pay. All right, so, we might have to build a collective voice on that one to encourage an alternative government to be prepared to do it. And there are very powerful interests involved in the health sector, but it is absolutely the right policy. I'm just checking whether I'm going on a bit long.
You've got another 5 minutes.
Oh, good. No, let's ditch that. That's all right. I'm very happy to make the slides available, for the data and the trends. So on the services front, so health is a great example. Energy, happy to talk about energy, but we've seen, the current federal government saying, privatisation, we need a bit of sort of regulatory dialogue. I think that's what we're dealing with at the moment, a dialogue with the energy retailers. In our view, what we have to understand that when you're talking about a market approach to services, it is almost impossible to create what you might call a market like for shoes. You just cannot do it. So what we're currently pushing for is in the energy area, for example, to say the government must regulate the basic design of an energy service. This is the shoe. This is the basic. And all the retailers have to provide it, and they have to say how much it costs so that we all know what we're buying. And, of course, we've seen a lot of commentary to flush out the fact that there's no transparency around the current pricing of these plans that people are coming on, so that people are not able to make, the wonderful, glorious choice associated with the market approach. Aged care, I don't know whether there's anybody involved in aged care at the moment, but there are big concerns as we see, further sort of individualisation around the provision of aged care, the lack of transparency about that, the amount of money that will be spent in marketing. Okay. Can I just for a moment, though, talk about early childhood? It's been really good that we've had this kind of discussion about education, the sort of so-called Gonski debate. And I won't go into detail about some of the concerns, but I think at least we've had a recognition that it is universal value that every child is entitled to a great education, and that it should be financed in a way which ensures there is equity in the delivery of that education. But our early childhood area is just unbelievably chaotic, inadequate, and when we tried, I'm looking at Marion here, when we tried collectively as well as separately to influence the federal government over its childcare package reform, which is essentially a market model, right? You get a bucket of money and you go out and you have a go at trying to afford childcare. The government designed its reform, which had some elements of something a bit better, but it was fully tied to workforce participation. This is still seen as transactional around, well, how much we'll give you, how much you'll earn. You've got to make sure, essentially, you're in paid work for this system to be triggered for you. But the reality, of course, is it is about an early childhood education that as a country like Australia, if we are, how can we possibly accept that about 1 in 4 children or 1 in 5 children will get to primary school disadvantaged and behind? Because that's kind of what Gonski was designed on, that presumption that that's what we're fixing into the system, and yet we've done nothing to properly ensure there's universal access to early childhood education and care for every child in Australia. And for the parents in the room, you'll know it's extremely hard sometimes to find the childcare, and also to understand that is a very important place for families who may be experiencing difficulties or financial or social insecurity to get the kind of support that is associated with ensuring that children then get the very best start in life, so that we are starting to change the blocks that you need to stand on in order to have a fair go. But it would be remiss of me not to finish with a little bit about tax, because I love talking about tax. Helen loves talking about tax. She is a fantastic voice about multinational corporations, and there's some amazing, I think, scrutiny being put on it. The public is over it, and we are seeing some action, maybe not as much as we'd like, but we are seeing some action there. We also say that the primary agenda on the tax front, yes, there is that sort of the argument that you just want to tax the rich more because you don't like people who are rich. Well, that's really, it's kind of neither here nor there. I think everybody is different depending on, who they are. I know some wonderful people who have a lot of money, and I know some, anyway. We have a tax system for a reason. We have a tax system because we need to generate the revenue as a community so that we can ensure that we have the things in place that we need so that every child, adult and older person can live a decent life. That's it. They got the guts of it. And the first thing we should be doing is absolutely getting rid of the tax concessions and loopholes that are, and we use the term first, no longer fit for purpose. It's become used a lot by others, but the list is pretty long, and we've had some wins in policy. Maybe not all of it in place yet. Negative gearing, capital gains discount, a shifting from stamp duty towards a broad-based land tax. Land in Australia, and yes, it is important to reflect on the history of the acquisition of land in this country. I want to really acknowledge that. The reality is that if you own land, you've got wealthier in Australia. And it is extraordinary that we have one of the narrow bases of land tax of any comparative country. And that would be a tough reform, but we have all said it's one of the ones that's really crucial for us to build in greater equity to the generation of revenue. And trusts, I think we finally had a party come out and say they're going to do something about trusts. So for this, it says to me that the public is absolutely, by and large, they're ready for policy experts, for those who are working in the engine room of design, to continue to propagate these ideas and to push forward. There are days, I think, when we all feel pretty unhappy about the cultural debates in the country. Same-sex marriage, drug testing, etc. But for me, part of it is let us not be distracted. Let us build the community leadership where people are really wanting to know how we can make sure that we are going to live in a society where people are not lonely, where you are going to be okay, and that your children can have confidence for a great future. Thanks.
Thanks, Cassie, and thanks very much for putting up with the distractions of the slideshow and for showing us your emails. I noticed that none of mine were opened. So now I'm sure you've got some questions for Helen and Cassandra. Yes.
My question, please, is for Cassandra. In the light of the information which you may have in relation to Queensland, but probably not because you're from South Australia, at the present time, on average, something in excess of 480 people a week are having their electricity cut off. It's more than 20,000 a year. One of the ways that I can see that there could be some minor alleviation to this is, in fact, if you were to come out publicly to support the removal of GST on electricity across the board in every state in Australia. At the present time, every hospital, doctor's surgery, dental surgery, small business, and the people on the end of the line, whatever they're buying in relation to electricity, and particularly their electricity bill, is saddled with GST.
Look, I can't provide an immediate comment on that idea. I think ideas in this area are always really, really welcome. But what we are saying is that energy is an essential service. It is not about a market. And we actually need to design the regulatory environment so that you cannot be disconnected. There may be other flow-on consequences if you are genuinely a bad payer, but that disconnection is not actually the outcome of that behaviour. Because the level of disconnections are going up, absolutely. And the energy concession arrangements around the country, which are variable from state to territory, they are usually fixed amounts rather than designed by reference to your capacity to pay, for example. So they're very poorly designed. And of course, this picture I've talked about in my presentation about the reduced adequacy of incomes for people on very low and fixed incomes. So there is definitely, everybody has a bit to do on this question of ensuring affordability and security of supply for people. Whilst I talked about the retailers and what we think they should be doing, there is clearly an issue also over on the adequacy of incomes for people. Because in fact, the biggest cost for you is your housing cost. I think people are acutely aware of the energy bills because they kind of come in a particular way, and it's quite a harsh experience of sort of that bill shock. For example, what we know now is there's a much greater proportion of people who are actually, I'm not going to use the word choosing to become homeless, but are saying ultimately for them, they're better in terms of being able to meet other needs. Actually, they're stopping being housed because that's actually the biggest underlying cost for people. So there's a big debate about energy, as you know. I don't have a clear position on that one, but we've certainly got a raft of other things we do.
Thank you. Dave?
G'day, my name's Dave Copeman. Just a quick question, I guess, for both of you. Both of you kind of alluded to the fact that this is an issue around power, and that, you know, there's a real inequality of power. I guess, Dr. Helen, for you in terms of Oxfam and Cassandra in terms of the partner organisation or the member organisations of the Council of Social Service, what are you or your organisations doing to help the people who don't have that power build power? and actually take action around some of those issues and what are the barriers to that prevent you doing more, and what can you do to overcome them?
Okay, how long have we got? So let me talk about Oxfam. I mean, we're part of a global organisation, and I guess that, you know, we see ourselves as global campaigners, and there are a number of issues where we mobilise around the world. So if our main mission is to eradicate poverty, we think you have to pull the big levers of change, and we've taken a particular focus on a number of issues where we think we can make a substantial difference for people living in poverty. One of those is certainly on inequality, and the sort of things that we talk about are global tax reform, because we think that in many of the countries we work in, but also I think in many of the Western countries, there are a group of people who are completely marginalised and disenfranchised. And I guess what's happened in America in terms of the politics there is a really good example of, you know, what happens when you leave a whole community out. Now, our focus is actually in the developing world, but what we're trying to do is to marshal the arguments in the OECD context, in the context of the World Economic Forum, to actually demonstrate that people care about those other people in Asia, in Africa, in South America, in the countries that are really quite, you know, disenfranchised and poor, and when inequality is having an impact. We also mobilise around climate change, because we think one of the biggest barriers to people actually being lifted out of poverty is what's happening to the environment. The other thing we try to do, I guess, is to bring some of that mobilisation into the lives of people in countries like Australia. So the best example is the garment industry example. And one of the challenges for us, if you talk about what are the barriers at the moment, is that the whole narrative in Australian politics at the moment is around austerity, around containment, about, you know, lower your head and look after our own backyard. And you will speak to the fact we're not even doing that terribly well. But it means that it's very hard to actually say we're part of a global community, and we also have a role to play in the world. So the garment industry is a really good way of connecting everyday Australians to what the circumstances are for people in other countries, to say that your activism can actually change the conditions in which women in the main are working in many of these garment industries. And you know, I've been to visit them, and the conditions are horrific. And our research indicates that people do care. Even though they might be struggling here with their own circumstances, they still care about what happens in other bits of the world. So we try to bring some of those issues back into the Australian community to connect with the lives of people here and people overseas, and to encourage activism around those issues as well. We mobilise, we have campaigns, we have online petitions, but it's also trying to create a narrative that basically puts human beings at the heart of it, and the fact that it's in all of our interest to invest in a better community, whether it's here or whether it's in Bangladesh or whether it's in the Pacific or whatever the case may be. Now, there are lots of other things that we campaign on, but that's the way to do it. But it's challenging at the moment, because the narrative globally is kind of look over there, and it's about demonising people, and even the discussions in the last week around the kind of the impact of the colonial past and how that's depicted in statues, and everything just reverts to this kind of nasty common baseline of narrative. And so I think what we're trying to do is to partly rebut that, but also to create an alternative narrative is about what the possibilities are, what the responsibilities are. And they're the responsibilities of individuals, but they're the responsibilities of governments. Governments can make huge differences. They're the responsibilities of business. And it's kind of alarming that in some cases business is sort of leading governments in some of the social policy areas to at least raise issues. Yeah, that's kind of the package of what we're trying to do, I guess.
Just a couple of things from me to add to Helen. I think on the sort of public voice or national, people have already got some level of power You can get your voice heard in places. I think one of the most important things we need to do is there's a huge amount of shame that is associated with not having enough. And of course, the sort of rhetoric I talked about at the beginning helps to fuel that, if you sort of we know that sort of the polling persistently shows that people think that the rest of the community is doing much better than they actually are. So, what's your average, your median wage? People say, about 80,000. Well, actually, the median wage is 54,000. So 50% of people earn 54,000 or less. Half of us earn 54,000 or less. Yeah, so that kind of really, persistently debunking those basic messages around, who the community is, so that people have a greater confidence that actually I'm kind of normal what I'm dealing with. Then I think secondly, privately, definitely in this area of where people do speak up to talk about their personal circumstances, certain medias can really come in and, the sort of the welfare bashing stuff, for example. And I think privately it's really important that we see people as a human rights defender. It is very important to get on the phone, find them, let them know, are you okay, anything that we can do for you, because, it's like, it's pretty scary, and each time somebody disappears, that undermines that effort, because it does take a lot of courage to, speak. And then I think on the sort of kind of structural question, of course, in the union, there's a great power and a tradition of organising. Yeah, so, it's been great to see the Australian Unemployed Workers Union get going, based out of Melbourne, but, it's really great to see that voice coming up. And we've just had, Sally might have talked about this morning, the CDP, the Indigenous First Peoples Union. Fantastic, that sort of stuff. I think beyond that, a lot of service people in human services will there's a risk that we've got caught up quite a lot in service delivery. And I think remembering that you are community leaders as well, with a lot of knowledge. And if we talk about economic development, social development, others may, in terms of the growing consensus about the place-based, regional approaches. So fostering that kind of coming together at that kind of regional level. Who's out there? How can we spend some time together and to then be able to kind of build those collective voices more and more? I think that's because there's an economic agenda, an environment one and a social one that actually binds people together.
Thanks, Cassie.
Then you know who to call to say, are you okay?
So we've got about 5 minutes of questions. Might get a couple more in. 2 up the back there.
I guess my question is to Dr. Goldie. I guess questioning one thing you said was that we've got an austere government. I come from a regional area 2 hours north of here, one of the poorest federal electorates. We see lots of government money spent on building better regions. So it's vote buying for the middle class, while our kids are not ready for school compared to Queenslanders, income support. So I guess more a statement than a question, but whether you want to comment on that.
Of course, it's a great point, we have, searing scrutiny and debate over the cost benefit of that's childcare. Or remember, Mariam, we had to, they kept saying, we have to fund the childcare package by cutting income support from single parents. That was the basic formula for financing the childcare package. When we come to building things, the Snowy Hydro, what do they cut? Anyway, Adani, others, of course. And there is a gender analysis that I sometimes like to bring to that, actually.
With very limited knowledge of the subject, I get the feeling that the federal government's saving a lot of welfare money by making it very difficult for people to use the system. They have to report income weekly, they have to have the app, they have to have access to a computer. I walked here this morning down George Street and saw a number of homeless people in the street, some still asleep. How do they tap into welfare? I've no idea. Some people would say that rather than having a system where you have to prove that you're needy, we have a system where you have negative income tax or living wage, whatever it might be. We give people the money, and if they earn enough, we take it away from them, which is the sort of opposite of what we do now. Does ACOS have a view about whether that's a good thing to consider?
I think it's a fantastic debate we're having, rethinking what will work into the future. I mean, there are different views. I don't know whether Jim's still here, around what is going on in the labour market and to what extent we will see really, a sort of serious escalation of not enough economic, employment opportunities because of automation and other things. And so I think that's why we're getting, both from the so-called left and from the right, some discussions about the universal basic income idea, for example. So, I mean, what I say at the moment is let's keep debating it and keep looking at it. I mean, maybe, you might look at a very particular, so your particular area of where there's a lot of people, where there's just not enough work and the social consequences of, it's not easy to leave. You've got family, community, are there places we could do a trial there to see, well, what would happen if we just provided a floor and allowed people to come together to, get the best technology into the area and see what we could do in terms of new economic futures for a region, some of that. I don't resolve, though, from the position today, which is that we should be securing a basic income for the people who desperately need it immediately, which is why I still focus on making sure the adequacy of the social security system is right, and that we absolutely defend any of more compliance and, making it even harder for people. We've got to win the policy debate, and we've got to win the public sentiment debate on that it is a waste of taxpayer. I use that in quotes because actually in different ways we all pay taxes. Don't forget the GST. We all pay for the system, and is it working? I mean, business, we've got a lot of consensus from business actually about things like work for the dole. Nobody thinks that's a good idea. It makes people more unemployable. But yes, I think, and the living wage movement, I don't know whether there's a lot of discussions going on amongst the union movement around that, but I think that kind of thinking is what we've got to keep staying with and testing.
Time for one very, very quick one. Yep. Quick answer and quick response.
Dr. Goldie, I'm in favour of social housing. To make it quick, what government level should control it? And should nurses and people in those sorts of situations be included in it?
Well, look, in the sort of jargon of housing policy, social housing is where the rent you pay is in accordance with your capacity to pay by your income, yeah? Then you've got affordable housing, which is discounted to the market rate, so 20% less than the market. And then you've got the open private rental market there, and then who provides it? It can either be government, and as we know, government is pretty much trying to get out of it, right? Community housing, which is a mix of affordable and social housing, and then of course we've got a lot of, private people in the private rental market as landlords, and we can have a whole discussion about the risk to the economic security of the country by continuing to encourage the so-called mum and dad investor into private rental, because interest rates are going to go up and it's going to get very, very ugly for people. But I think what I said is there's a bit of in housing policy, there's a bit of a view that government just should get out of it. They'll never build public housing again, And I kind of said, well, let's just pause on it, because actually, who has the greatest capacity of low-cost financing is government. Yeah? And if you asked a young person today, how would you feel about, the government being involved in actually ensuring that there was housing, where there was a new, they were trying to open up regional activity? I think that'd be okay. So I think both we've got to absolutely insist on ensuring we've got housing which is tied to incomes, because in terms of the risks for people on very low incomes and the private rental market, the gap is always going to be crushing. So we've got to have that kind of social protection housing in place. And then I think we need to really work on saying this is not about politics, it's about financing. and the best financing models, and we're not there.
Okay,
Political.
We might finish up on that point. I'd like you to show your appreciation for Dr. Helen Szoke and Dr. Cassandra Goldie. Thank you.
Thank you.